So at Parabon, my team and I have been able to have over 350 successful identifications using those two smallest databases, using those consented databases. And our policy is to stick with just those databases because of the concern that the public could turn against this tool. We don't want to just solve one case and lose out on being able to use this for potentially hundreds of thousands, millions of cases in the future that will be in the benefit of public safety. And so that is the decision that we have followed. And those are the best practices that I have promoted from the very beginning and advocated for. However, the more violent crimes I've been working and seen the incredibly negative impact it has on surviving victims, their families, and society as a whole, I can really see both sides now a lot more than I did when I first started working with law enforcement. I've been doing it almost 8 years now, and you do get so discouraged seeing how many people's lives are destroyed and families are torn apart because of people that are willing to commit these crimes. They cannot use Ancestry DNA and 23andMe, which are the two largest databases, because they don't accept raw data uploads. You have to spit in that tube and mail it in. And that's the only way you're going to get your DNA in that database. When we're dealing with forensic files, that is what's called a SNP data file that is made up of hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. And they're creating these case files for criminal cases in an outside lab. They're not running it through Ancestry or 23andMe. They're not going to accept non-pristine samples. When we spit in that tube, the DNA we're sending in is really high quality, really pristine, and we send in a large amount. And so when we're dealing with these forensic samples, they're often tiny amounts of DNA, touch DNA in this case. We might be dealing with mixtures, contaminated, degraded DNA. So those samples are not pristine enough to make it through the process at 23andMe and Ancestry. Their labs would deny those samples, and they would say, oh, you've got to submit a new sample. Well, obviously, if it's a forensic case, there's likely not anything else or any better DNA to submit. But MyHeritage has made the decision to accept uploads, and that makes them vulnerable to law enforcement's use. Now, their terms of service bar it, but what has been explained to me by law enforcement is that they can go anywhere the public can go. So if you and I can upload a raw data file into MyHeritage legally, so can law enforcement. And so it's really not a legal question. And that's what the judge has ruled in line with that. And that's what we're seeing consistently across case law now. This is not the first case where this has been brought up. It's not the first case where a judge has weighed in on this question and made a similar ruling, because legality and companies' own terms of service are not the same thing. And so that is how the FBI is able to legally use that non-consented database, that database that has their own set of terms of service, because the public can use it. And it is case law that law enforcement is allowed to go anywhere that the public is. So it's not a question of legality. I'm not at all surprised the judge ruled the way that he did in this case. It's really more a question of public perception. This is an ethical question, not a legal question. And so the reason I've always argued against using the MyHeritage database or any database that it's against their terms of service and that people haven't been able to make that decision for themselves, whether they want to help law enforcement in this way or not, is that it really could have a chilling effect on this incredible tool that's been doing so much good. This is a tool that fully relies on public support and participation. And so if people get a negative view of investigative genetic genealogy and law enforcement's use of this data, they could pull their data, they could stop DNA testing, and this tool would then not be able to be used for any of the good that we've been able to use it for. I mean, it really is an incredible tool to improve public safety, to get violent criminals off the streets, to stop serial killers and serial rapists from ever becoming that, because we can identify them after the first time. And so I can see that I'm of two minds in this. I really think that we need to follow best practices and be ethical and responsible in this use of this incredible tool that we have built for human identification. But there's also this public safety aspect that we have to weigh. So we always have this tension between public safety and privacy, personal privacy. And we're seeing that in genetic genealogy all the time. Where do you draw that line? We could have a national database where everybody would be required to provide their DNA, and intimate violent crimes would be solved immediately, right? So that would be fantastic for public safety and saving lives. But most of us don't want that. We don't want that much infringement into our personal privacy. But with genetic genealogy, it's not everybody, but it's your cousins, right? If any of your relatives out to second cousins once removed have tested, that can lead to you, and even further out. Once you start getting to third cousins and further out, they're not all going to share DNA with you. But most people, especially people with deep roots in the US, with Northwest European ancestry, can be identified pretty quickly. And so the bigger database you have, the more quickly that can be accomplished. So we saw that in this case where they were trying to identify this very violent individual that left his DNA behind it, or let me say that again. They were trying to identify the person who left his DNA behind at the crime scene, presumably the killer, as quickly as they could, so nobody else would get hurt, so they could stop this person in his tracks. And they were using these two consented databases, these very small databases. I've built Brian Koberger's tree, and it is not the type that would typically have really great matches. So I'm not at all surprised their top match was 70 centimorgans. 70 centimorgans is approximately a third cousin, which means you would share great-great-grandparents. And only one branch of your family tree. We try to connect to both sides of someone's family, to all four of their grandparents if we can, in order to really narrow down the search to just one immediate family, one set of siblings, or one person, if there's just one person of that gender in that family, like in Brian's case. So I expected this would be difficult for them when I built that tree. He's mostly Italian. His last name wouldn't tell you that, but most of his tree is. And those are more recent immigrants to the US. And then he has that one German, fairly recent immigrant line as well. And so for them to just be working in those small databases, they just didn't have enough data to quickly identify him. So they made the decision to upload to MyHeritage, which is not a consented database and it's against their terms of service, and also to upload to the full GEDmatch. So that included the people that were not opted in to law enforcement. And they did that because I'm sure they weighed public safety versus the potential ethical questions of doing that. I can see both sides. Having worked so many violent crimes, I definitely want genetic genealogy to be able to save lives and stop people from ever being victimized and bring answers and justice to families. But I also think it's really important that we protect this tool for the future and we don't turn public opinion against what we're doing and lose the support of the public. We do have to be concerned about public perception. Now, I've been part of a long-term study with academics that have shown that a very high percentage of the public is extremely supportive of what we're doing. And that has also influenced my opinion on this and my approach to this.
Brian Koberger case. FBI's DNA tactics didn't violate law, but they raise another public safety concern. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore says police use of IgG has overwhelming public support, but investigators must maintain ethics to keep it that way. With great investigative power, genetic genealogists have a great responsibility to conduct themselves ethically to preserve a system that is entirely reliant on public participation to solve violent crimes, according to C.C. Moore, a pioneer of the industry and the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs. The use of investigative genetic genealogy to solve violent crimes has overwhelming public support, she said, but privacy concerns are still an issue in cases like University of Idaho student murders, suspect Brian Koberger's, where the FBI accessed two databases that purport to exclude law enforcement from their services. As a result, unwitting users could be submitting clues that lead detectives to their own relatives without knowing it. Transcripts unsealed of a closed-door hearing on the defense's attempt to have DNA evidence thrown out of court revealed that the FBI violated a Department of Justice interim policy and the terms of service of the two private databases agents turned to after the smaller ones. Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch Puro didn't pan out. Our policy is to stick with just those databases because of the concern that the public could turn against this tool, Moore said, explaining why her team at the private lab avoids doing what the FBI did. We don't want to just solve one case and lose out on being able to use this for potentially hundreds of thousands, millions of cases in the future. The FBI declined to comment and instead pointed to Judge Stephen Hippler's February 17th order, in which he wrote that investigators had not violated Koberger's constitutional rights or broken any laws when they uploaded samples to MyHeritage and GEDmatch. This is not the first case where this has been brought up, Moore told Fox News Digital. It's not the first case where a judge has weighed in on this question and made a similar ruling, because legality and companies' own terms of service are not the same thing. And so that is how the FBI is able to legally use that non-consented database. 4 University of Idaho students were stabbed to death in a home on November 13th, 2022. Madison Mogan, 21, Kaylee Goncalves, 21, Xana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20. Under Mogan's body, police found a knife sheath that helped crack the case. It had a DNA sample on it. The sample did not match anyone in the FBI's National Criminal Database, nor did it match anyone in two small genealogy databases that share their material with law enforcement. So the FBI checked two other publicly accessible databases that ultimately led them to Kohberger, who was first identified as a person of interest on December 19, 2022, and arrested on December 30, 2022. If investigators hadn't turned to IGG, a suspect may have never been apprehended. They'd spent weeks with no solid leads, although Kohberger was studying for a PhD in criminology at Washington State University, just 10 miles from the crime scene. He had driven home to his parents' house in Pennsylvania before he was arrested. The more violent crimes I've been working and seen, the incredibly negative impact it has on surviving victims, their families, and society as a whole, I can really see both sides now a lot more than I did when I first started working with law enforcement, Moore said. There's certainly a part of me that is supportive of doing everything we can within the law to stop these people in their tracks. Anywhere the public can, Moore said. Even though the individual database's terms of service may say that detectives need to stay out, they aren't violating the law by going in anyway. The concern among critics, however, is that law enforcement could risk dissuading members of the public from participating in genetic genealogy, testing over concerns that their data could be taken behind their backs, despite companies claiming it is protected. Many users want to trace their family trees, not necessarily help solve crimes. The two largest databases, 23andMe and AncestryDNA, don't face this issue because they don't allow copied files of DNA samples to be uploaded. They require them to come directly from the source, a highly accurate sample from a cheek swab. That kind of sample typically doesn't exist in the early stages of a case where police turn to IGG, usually with something collected from a crime scene. So far, the methods continue to show strong public support, Moore said. Most people out there want us to use this tool to stop violent criminals, she told Fox News Digital. I believe it was 91% of the people that we surveyed said they want it used for this purpose, and I was surprised how many people even wanted it used for lesser crimes.